The date is July 24, 1964. The place is a nondescript industrial building in the woods of rural Rhode Island, where the evening shift has just begun. Inside, a 37-year-old man named Robert Peabody is working alone in a cavernous room filled with tanks, pipes, and the low hum of machinery that processes one of the most dangerous substances on Earth, enriched uranium. He is not a scientist. He is not a nuclear engineer. He is a production technician in his second week on the job, working a second shift he never wanted, trying to earn enough overtime to support a wife and 9 children at home. He has been given a task that should be routine, cleaning a tank, and he has been given a bottle. What he does not know, what he cannot know, is that this bottle has been mislabeled, that the room around him is a disaster waiting to happen, and that in the next 30 seconds he will receive a dose of radiation so massive that it will make him, by some measurements, the most radioactive human being in history. At 6:55 in the evening, Robert Peabody pours the contents of that bottle into a tank containing uranium solution. The moment the liquids meet, the room erupts in blue light. A nuclear chain reaction has begun. The flash is so intense it blinds him temporarily. The heat is instant and searing. The explosion throws him backward, splashing radioactive liquid from floor to ceiling, drenching his clothes, his skin, his hair. He stumbles to his feet, screaming, tearing at his clothes as they burn against his body. He runs. Through the building, out into the night air, leaving a trail of radioactive contamination behind him. His co-workers find him outside, naked, vomiting blood, his nose and ears bleeding, his body already beginning the process of cellular collapse that no medicine can stop. He will be fully conscious for almost everything that happens next. He will know what is happening to him. He will ask, repeatedly, if he is going to die. And 49 hours later, he will become the first. And to this day, the only fatality from acute radiation syndrome in the history of the American commercial nuclear industry. But this is not where the story ends. It is where it begins. Because Robert Peabody was not just a victim of a terrible accident. He was the product of a system that valued production over safety, of corners cut and warnings ignored, of a facility so poorly managed that multiple people would later say they were surprised it had not happened sooner. His death would expose a culture of negligence. It would raise questions about corporate accountability that remain unanswered, and it would leave behind a mystery that haunts his family to this day, the question of what really happened to his body and whether the ashes his widow received were his at all. This is the story of Robert Peabody. This is the story of the Wood River Junction criticality accident. And this is the story of how, in the pursuit of the atom, one ordinary man became a ghost in the machine. Robert Peabody was not supposed to be there. Not in that building, not on that shift, not handling that material. He was a man caught in the machinery of post-war America, trying to do what millions of men like him were told to do. Work hard, support your family, and trust that the systems around you were built to keep you safe. He was born in 1927, grew up during the Depression, came of age during World War II, and entered adulthood at the dawn of the atomic age. Like many working-class men of his generation, he did not have the luxury of choosing a career that fulfilled him. He had the necessity of finding work that paid. By 1964, Robert Peabody was 37 years old. He had a wife named Anna, and together they had 9 children. 9 mouths to feed, 9 bodies to clothe, 9 futures to worry about. The family lived in a modest home, and the math of their lives was simple and brutal. More children meant more expenses, which meant more work, which meant less time at home, which meant working even more to compensate for the guilt of not being there. It was a trap that millions of American families recognized, a cycle of sacrifice that was supposed to be temporary, that was supposed to lead somewhere better, but that often led only to exhaustion and the creeping fear that the next paycheck might not stretch far enough. Peabody had been working as a mechanic, but the job was not enough. When he heard about an opening at the United Nuclear Corporation facility in Wood River Junction, Rhode Island, he saw an opportunity. The plant processed uranium fuel for nuclear reactors, a new and growing industry that promised good wages and steady employment. The atomic age was booming. The government was investing billions in nuclear power. The word atomic carried a futuristic sheen, a sense of progress and American technological superiority. To work in that facility was to participate in the future. It was to be part of something bigger than yourself. What Peabody did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the United Nuclear Corporation had already developed a reputation for carelessness. The facility at Wood River Junction had been processing uranium since 1959, converting raw uranium into fuel for the Navy's nuclear submarines and, later, for civilian power reactors. It was dangerous work that required precision, training, and rigorous safety protocols. But the plant was chronically understaffed, and the staff it did have were often undertrained. Procedures were improvised. Safety inspections were missed. Radioactive material had been spilled so many times that workers joked darkly about the hotspots around the facility. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, still in its infancy, had limited oversight. The company, focused on meeting production quotas in government contracts, had limited patience for delays. Peabody was hired as a production technician. His job was to operate the machinery that processed the uranium, to monitor the tanks and pipes, to ensure that the delicate chemistry of nuclear fuel production proceeded without incident. He was given minimal training, a few days of instruction, some handouts, shadowing of more experienced workers who were themselves only marginally qualified. The plant was desperate for labor, and Peabody was desperate for work. The match was made not by careful qualification, but by mutual desperation. He did not want to work the evening shift. The position he had been hired for was supposed to be days, but shortly after he started, he was informed that he would need to rotate to evenings. The reason was simple. The plant was behind schedule. Government contracts demanded output, and output demanded bodies. Peabody could have refused. He could have walked away and looked for other work. But he had 9 children at home, and the overtime pay for evening work was too important to sacrifice. So he agreed. On July 24, 1964, he reported for his second evening shift, still learning the rhythms of the plant, still unfamiliar with the specific dangers of the tasks he had been assigned. That evening, he was told to clean a tank. It was a routine procedure, or should have been. The tank contained uranium solution that had become contaminated with organic material, and it needed to be purified. The standard method was to add a solvent called trichloroethane, which would separate the impurities and allow them to be removed. Peabody was given a bottle and told to proceed. The bottle was not properly labeled. The room was dimly lit. The plant was chaotic, still recovering from a recent cleanup that had left equipment scattered and procedures confused. Peabody was working alone, without direct supervision, without anyone to double-check his actions. He was, in other words, exactly where the system had placed him, undertrained, under pressure, and unaware of how little stood between him and catastrophe. He was trying to do the right thing. He was trying to be a good provider. He was trying to survive in an economy that demanded everything and promised little in return. And at 6:55 in the evening, as he lifted that bottle and began to pour, he became something else entirely. He became a statistic. He became a cautionary tale. He became, in the cold language of nuclear safety reports, the first fatality from acute radiation syndrome in the U.S. commercial nuclear industry. But before that moment, before the flash and the screams and the 49 hours of agony that followed, he was simply a man, a father, a husband, a worker trying to make ends meet in a world that treated him as expendable. And that is where his story truly begins, not with his death, but with the life he was trying to build and the forces that conspired to take it from him. To understand what happened to Robert Peabody, you have to understand the place where he worked. The United Nuclear Corporation facility at Wood River Junction was not some gleaming temple of atomic science. It was a converted textile mill, a squat industrial building nestled in the woods of rural Rhode Island, surrounded by trees and the quiet of a region that had once thrived on manufacturing but was now struggling to find its place in a changing economy. The building had been adapted for nuclear work, but adaptation is not the same as design. Where purpose-built nuclear facilities had redundant safety systems, engineered controls, and layers of protocol, Wood River Junction had improvisation, shortcuts, and a management culture that prioritized production over precaution. The facility had opened in 1959, one of many small plants that sprang up across the United States in the rush to develop nuclear power. The Atomic Energy Commission, eager to promote the civilian use of atomic energy, licensed dozens of companies to handle enriched uranium, often with minimal oversight. The assumption was that the dangers were understood, that the lessons of Los Alamos and the early nuclear laboratories had been learned, that American industry could be trusted to manage this new and terrible force. That assumption was wrong. From its earliest days, Wood River Junction was plagued by problems. The plant processed uranium-235, the fissile isotope that powers nuclear reactors and atomic bombs. U-235 is dangerous in ways that are not immediately obvious. It emits radiation, yes, but its true hazard lies in its potential for criticality. The moment when enough fissile material comes together in the right configuration to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. A criticality accident is not a nuclear explosion in the sense of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It is something more insidious, a burst of intense radiation and heat, a flash of blue light, a release of energy that can kill anyone nearby within hours or days, leaving the building intact, but the people inside destroyed. Preventing criticality requires strict controls on the mass, geometry, and concentration of fissile material. There are rules, developed through hard experience at Los Alamos and other nuclear facilities, about how much uranium can be in one place, what shape it can take, what solutions it can be dissolved in, and how operations must be monitored. At Wood River Junction, these rules were treated as suggestions. Workers routinely exceeded mass limits. Tanks were used for purposes they were not designed for. Procedures were written, filed, and ignored. The specific process that would kill Robert Peabody was called the organic purification system, and it was a disaster waiting to happen. The system used a solvent trichloroethane to remove organic impurities from uranium solutions. The chemistry was delicate, and the geometry of the tanks was critical. The tanks were supposed to be tall and narrow, designed to prevent the uranium solution from reaching a critical mass. But the plant had been modified over the years, and the modifications had not been carefully analyzed for safety. A tank that had originally been designed for one purpose was now being used for another. A system that had been marginal was now dangerous. And then there was the human element. The plant was chronically understaffed. Workers were tired, undertrained, and under pressure to meet production quotas. The turnover was high, which meant that experienced workers were constantly leaving and being replaced by newcomers like Peabody, who had neither the time nor the training to develop the instincts that might have warned him something was wrong. The culture was one of improvisation and corner-cutting. If a bottle was mislabeled, you figured it out. If a procedure was unclear, you made your best guess. If the official way took too long, you found a faster way. In the weeks before the accident, the plant had been in chaos. A cleanup operation had scattered equipment and materials throughout the facility. Bottles of chemicals had been moved, relabeled, or not labeled at all. The normal routines that might have provided some protection had been disrupted. Workers later reported that they were surprised an accident had not happened sooner, that the conditions were so obviously unsafe that a catastrophe felt inevitable. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which should have been the backstop against this kind of negligence, was largely absent. The NRC had been created only in 1974, a decade after Peabody's death. In 1964, oversight was provided by the Atomic Energy Commission, which had a dual and conflicting mandate to promote the use of nuclear energy and to regulate its safety. The promotion side won. The AEC was eager to see the nuclear industry grow, and it was reluctant to impose strict standards that might slow that growth. Inspections were infrequent and perfunctory. Violations were noted, but rarely punished. The message to companies like United Nuclear was clear: produce and worry about the details later. The bottle that Robert Peabody picked up on the evening of July 24 was a symptom of this systemic failure. It should have contained trichloroethane, a solvent that would have cleaned the tank without danger. Instead, it contained concentrated uranium solution, a substance that would trigger a criticality event the moment it was poured into the tank Peabody was trying to clean. The bottle was mislabeled, or perhaps not labeled at all. It had been placed in the wrong location during the recent cleanup. No one had checked. No one had verified. The safeguards that should have prevented this, proper labeling, inventory control, supervision, training, had all failed, one by one, until only a single barrier remained: the judgment of a man who had been on the job for less than 2 weeks. This was the powder keg. This was the environment that transformed a routine task into a death sentence. And this was the system that would, in the aftermath of Peabody's death, face no serious consequences. The company would pay a small fine. No one would go to prison. The plant would continue operating, with some modifications, for another 2 decades. The lessons that should have been learned would be forgotten, only to be relearned in other accidents, in other facilities, with other workers who were just trying to do their jobs and go home to their families. Robert Peabody walked into this environment on the evening of July 24, 1964, unaware that he was the final safeguard in a system that had been designed to fail. He picked up that bottle. He walked to that tank, and at 6:55 p.m., he poured. The tank stood 18 inches in diameter, a stainless steel cylinder rising from the floor of the processing room like an industrial baptismal font. Around it, the evening shift hummed with the low thrum of machinery and the distant clank of metal on metal. Robert Peabody was alone in this space, or as alone as one could be in a facility where workers moved between rooms on tasks that required little coordination and even less oversight. He had been given his instructions: add the solvent, clean the tank, move on to the next task. The production quota waited for no one. He lifted the bottle. It was a standard glass container, the kind used throughout the facility for chemicals and solutions, indistinguishable from dozens of others that lined the shelves and cluttered the work surfaces. The recent cleanup had scattered inventory across the plant. Bottles had been moved, consolidated, reorganized by workers who were themselves working from imperfect memory and incomplete records. The label, if there was one, did not register as wrong. Or perhaps there was no label at all. In the dim lighting of the processing room, with the pressure of the shift ticking away and the accumulated fatigue of a man working his second job to feed 9 children, Peabody did what he had been trained to do. He trusted the system. He trusted that the bottle in his hand was the right bottle. He trusted that someone, somewhere, had checked. He trusted that the plant where he worked would not ask him to handle something that could kill him. At 6:55 p.m., he began to pour. The uranium solution entered the tank containing the existing uranium carbonate solution. For a brief moment, perhaps a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The liquids mixed. The geometry of the tank, already marginal, shifted. The concentration of fissile material, carefully controlled by design but now overwhelmed by the addition of concentrated solution, reached a threshold that had been calculated in laboratories, warned about in safety manuals, and ignored in practice. The mass went critical. The flash was instantaneous and blinding. A burst of blue light filled the room. The Cherenkov radiation. Visible proof that particles were moving faster through the liquid than light itself could travel in that medium. It was beautiful and terrible. The same blue that had glowed in the depths of reactors, that had marked the death of scientists at Los Alamos. That was the signature of the atom unleashed. The heat followed immediately, searing the air, vaporizing a portion of the solution, creating a pressure wave that threw Peabody backward. He never had a chance to understand what was happening. The explosion was small, not the destructive force of a weapon, but sufficient to spray radioactive liquid from floor to ceiling, 12 feet up, coating the walls, the equipment, and Peabody himself. The solution saturated his clothes, his hair, his skin. It entered his eyes, his nose, his mouth. His wedding ring, that simple band of gold, became a focal point for radiation exposure that would later measure 7 sieverts to that single finger alone. Peabody stumbled backward, blinded, disoriented, his body already absorbing a radiation dose that would prove fatal within hours. The pain was immediate and intense, not the pain of burns, though those would come, but the cellular chaos of ionizing radiation tearing through tissue, breaking DNA strands, destroying the fundamental machinery of life at the molecular level. He could not see. He could not think. He could only react. He ran. Through the processing room, out into the corridor, tearing at his clothes as they burned against his skin. The radioactive solution was everywhere on him, and every second of contact increased his exposure. He stripped naked in his panic, leaving a trail of contaminated fabric and footprints that would later be measured in rems and millisieverts, a radioactive breadcrumb trail marking his desperate flight. His co-workers, alerted by the flash or the explosion or his screams, found him outside the building, collapsed on the ground, vomiting blood, his nose bleeding, his ears bleeding, his body beginning the catastrophic shutdown that would end his life. The response was immediate and chaotic. Someone called for help. Someone, recognizing the signs of radiation exposure, began the protocols that had been drilled into them. Protocols designed for spills, for contamination, for manageable accidents. No one had protocols for this. No one had imagined a worker receiving, in an instant, a dose of radiation measured in hundreds of sieverts. The plant's health physicist arrived, surveyed the scene, and began the grim mathematics of exposure assessment. The numbers were beyond anything in the manuals. The numbers were impossible. And yet, the source of the radiation, the criticality was ongoing. The tank was still criticality. In the processing room, the solution continued to boil, the chain reaction self-sustaining, releasing neutrons and gamma radiation into the space where Peabody had stood. The blue glow continued, visible through the doorway, a silent testament to the ongoing nuclear reaction. Workers who approached to assess the situation received dangerous doses themselves. Someone had to stop it, had to break the geometry that was sustaining the reaction, had to drain the tank, or add neutron absorbers, or do something to end the criticality before it killed more people. 3 men, Michael Crannell, Edward Hodgson, and William Wright, entered the room. They were not heroes in the sense of men seeking glory. They were workers who understood, however imperfectly, that the reaction had to be stopped, and that they were the only ones present who might be able to stop it. They approached the tank through the radiation field, their own exposure climbing with every second, and managed to drain the solution, breaking the critical geometry and ending the chain reaction. They received significant doses themselves. Crannell and Hodgson estimated at 100 rad, Wright at 15 rad, but they survived. Their quick action prevented a worse catastrophe, a sustained criticality that might have contaminated the entire facility and exposed more workers to lethal radiation. But for Robert Peabody, it was already too late. He lay outside, naked, bleeding, his body a map of contamination that would challenge the decontamination protocols of the era. The ambulance arrived. The decision was made to transport him to Rhode Island Hospital in Providence, the nearest facility capable of handling trauma. No one knew, in those first minutes, how to handle radiation exposure at this scale. No one knew that conventional medical treatment was irrelevant, that the damage was done at the cellular level, that his white blood cells were already dying, his chromosomes shattered, his immune system collapsing. They treated him as they would treat any accident victim: stabilize, transport, assess. At the hospital, the reality became clear. The radiation detectors screamed when brought near him. His body was so radioactive that he posed an exposure risk to the medical staff trying to save him. The doctors, facing something they had never encountered, consulted with nuclear experts, with the Atomic Energy Commission, with anyone who might know what to do for a man who had received a dose of radiation. 10, 20, 100 times the lethal threshold. The answer came back, implicit in the silence between words: nothing. There was nothing to be done. The damage was irreversible. The only question was how long he would survive and how much he would suffer. Peabody was conscious for much of the next 49 hours. He knew something was terribly wrong. He asked repeatedly whether he was going to die. The medical staff, bound by their own protocols and perhaps by their own disbelief at the scale of the exposure, offered reassurances that they knew were false. They attempted treatments that they knew would fail. They pumped fluids, administered antibiotics, tried to support his failing organs. But radiation at this level is not an injury to be treated. It is a total systemic collapse, a failure of the body's most basic functions, a death sentence written in broken DNA and dying cells. 49 hours after he lifted that bottle, 49 hours after the flash of blue light that marked the moment his life ended, Robert Peabody died. His heart failed, his organs shut down, his body finally surrendering to the damage that had been inflicted in an instant. He was 37 years old. He left behind a wife and 9 children. And he left behind a question that haunts the nuclear industry to this day: how could this have been allowed to happen? The ambulance carrying Robert Peabody arrived at Rhode Island Hospital in Providence shortly after the accident. And the moment the doors opened, the staff understood they were facing something beyond their experience. The radiation detectors brought near his body registered levels that seemed impossible. His skin, where the radioactive solution had splashed, showed signs of thermal burns. But these were the least of his injuries. The true damage was invisible, systemic, and total. Peabody was placed in isolation, not for contagion in the traditional sense, but because his body itself had become a radiation source, emitting gamma rays that posed a danger to anyone who spent too much time near him. Nurses and doctors rotated through his room, limiting their exposure, wearing dosimetry badges that tracked the radiation they absorbed with each visit. They were treating a man who was, in effect, a human dirty bomb, contaminated with fission products and activated materials from the criticality excursion. The medical response was improvised, because no protocol existed for this. Acute radiation syndrome at the levels Peabody had received. Estimates would later place his whole body dose at over 100 sieverts, with localized areas receiving far more, was not something that could be treated. It could only be witnessed. The doctors consulted with nuclear experts from the Atomic Energy Commission, from other facilities, from anywhere they could find someone who might understand what they were seeing. The answers were consistent and devastating. At these doses, the bone marrow is destroyed, the immune system collapses, the gastrointestinal lining sloughs away, and the central nervous system begins to fail. Death is certain. The only variable is time. Peabody was conscious for much of the first day. He was able to speak, to answer questions, to express his confusion and fear. He asked repeatedly what had happened, whether he was going to die, how long he had. The medical staff, caught between honesty and compassion, offered measured responses. They told him he had been in a serious accident. They told him they were doing everything they could. They did not tell him, or perhaps they did not fully grasp themselves, that his chromosomes had been shattered into fragments, that his cells had lost the ability to divide and renew, that his body was already dead in every way that mattered, still walking and talking only because the machinery of life takes time to wind down. The progression of his symptoms followed the classic pattern of acute radiation syndrome, but accelerated and intensified beyond anything in the medical literature. Within hours, his white blood cell count plummeted to near zero, destroying his ability to fight infection. His platelets dropped, leaving him unable to clot blood. The bleeding from his nose and ears, present from the moment of the accident, continued and worsened. His skin, particularly where the radioactive solution had contacted him directly, began to blister and necrose, the cells dying faster than they could be shed. By the second day, the gastrointestinal symptoms began. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, the classic signs of radiation damage to the intestinal lining. But in Peabody's case, these were not merely symptoms. They were the visible manifestation of his digestive tract literally falling apart. The cells lining his intestines, which normally renew themselves every few days, lost the ability to regenerate. The barrier between his gut and his bloodstream failed. Bacteria that normally inhabit the digestive tract began to migrate into his blood, causing sepsis in a body that had no immune system left to fight it. The medical team tried everything they could think of. They administered fluids and electrolytes to replace what he was losing. They gave him antibiotics to combat the infections that were inevitable and, in his condition, untreatable. They attempted to manage his pain, though the drugs available in 1964 were limited compared to modern palliative care. They consulted with specialists, with researchers, with anyone who might offer a treatment, a protocol, a hope. There was no hope. Peabody's condition deteriorated rapidly. He became delirious, lapsing in and out of consciousness. His blood pressure dropped as his circulatory system failed. His kidneys stopped functioning, poisoned by the breakdown products of his own dying cells. His skin, particularly on his hands and where the wedding ring had concentrated radiation exposure, became gangrenous. The smell in his isolation room was terrible. The scent of cellular death and bacterial overgrowth, masked imperfectly by the disinfectants used to protect the staff. Through it all, Anna Peabody waited. She had been notified of the accident, had rushed to the hospital, had been told the barest facts. Her husband had been injured at work. The injuries were serious. The doctors were doing everything they could. What she was not told, what perhaps no one could fully articulate, was that her husband had been killed not by fire or explosion or any conventional industrial hazard, but by the invisible, silent destruction of ionizing radiation. She waited in hospital corridors, surrounded by her children, trying to understand how a routine evening shift could have led to this. Peabody died at 2:15 p.m. on July 26, 1964, 49 hours after the accident. The official cause of death was listed as acute radiation syndrome, though the full medical description would include bone marrow failure, sepsis, gastrointestinal hemorrhage, and multiple organ failure. He was the first person in the United States to die from acute radiation exposure in a commercial nuclear facility. He would not be the last victim of such accidents worldwide, but he remains, to this day, the only fatality from acute radiation syndrome in the history of the American commercial nuclear industry. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. His body, still highly radioactive, posed a disposal problem that had never been faced before. The standard protocols for handling radioactive waste were designed for materials, not for human remains. The hospital, the company, and the Atomic Energy Commission struggled with questions that had no precedent. How do you bury a body that is itself a radiation hazard? How do you protect funeral workers, cemetery staff, the ground itself? What do you tell a widow who wants to bury her husband but cannot be allowed to see him, touch him, or even confirm that the ashes she eventually receives are truly his. Robert Peabody's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a systemic failure, a warning sign written in blood and radiation, a demonstration of what happens when safety is sacrificed for speed, when training is inadequate, when oversight is absent. The 49 hours he spent dying were not just the end of his life. They were the exposure of a culture of negligence that had existed for years, that had been warned about, that had been ignored, and that would continue to exist until forced to change by the weight of public attention and regulatory enforcement. But in those 49 hours, Peabody was not a symbol. He was a man, a father of 9, a husband, a worker who had trusted the system and been betrayed by it. And in his suffering, in his confusion, in his final hours of consciousness, when he must have known, on some level, that he was dying, he represented something that statistics and safety reports can never capture: the human cost of industrial negligence, paid in agony and fear, and the desperate, unanswered question of why. The body of Robert Peabody presented a problem that no one had anticipated. In the hours after his death, officials from United Nuclear Corporation, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the state of Rhode Island convened to discuss what should be done with the remains of a man who was, by any practical measure, still radioactive. The standard protocols for handling corpses were inadequate. The standard protocols for handling radioactive waste were inhumane. The result was a compromise that would haunt Anna Peabody for the rest of her life. The decision was made to cremate him. Cremation would reduce the volume of radioactive material, would concentrate the remaining isotopes in the ashes, and would allow for easier disposal or storage. But cremation of a radioactive body was not a simple matter. The crematorium would itself become contaminated. The furnace, the walls, the very air would be exposed to the radioactive particles released during the process. The facility would need to be decontaminated afterward, or abandoned, or shielded. The costs would be significant. The logistics were complex. And for Anna Peabody, the mother of 9 children who had just lost her husband, the process would be shrouded in secrecy and suspicion. She was told, in the days following Robert's death, that she could not see his body. The radiation levels were too high, the risk to her and her children too great. She was told that cremation was necessary, that it was the only safe option, that the company and the government would handle everything. She was told to wait. And then, weeks later, she was given a container. Inside were ashes, she was told, the remains of her husband, reduced by fire and radiation to a substance that could be held in 2 hands. But Anna Peabody was not a woman who accepted answers easily. She had questions that no one would answer directly. Why had she not been allowed to see Robert before the cremation? Why had the process taken weeks, when cremation normally took days? Why did the ashes she received show no radioactivity when tested with a Geiger counter? If her husband had been so radioactive that she could not touch him in death, why were his remains now inert, silent, harmless? The official story was that the cremation had been performed at a facility in Massachusetts, that the process had been handled with appropriate safety measures, that the ashes were indeed those of Robert Peabody. But Anna suspected otherwise. She believed, and would believe until her own death, that the ashes she received were not her husband's. She believed that Robert's body, still too radioactive to be safely cremated or buried, had been taken away, stored in a lead-lined coffin, sunk at sea, or hidden in some government facility where the inconvenient evidence of corporate negligence could be contained. The ashes in her hands, she concluded, were a substitute, a decoy, a lie offered to a grieving widow to close the books on a case that no one wanted to examine too closely. There was evidence to support her suspicions, or at least to prevent their dismissal. The timeline was irregular. The lack of radioactivity in the ashes was inexplicable, given what was known about Robert's exposure. The secrecy surrounding the cremation, the refusal to allow her to witness or even to know the location of the facility, the absence of documentation that should have been routine. All of these fueled her belief that she had been deceived. Anna Peabody was not a conspiracy theorist. She was a working-class woman with 9 children to raise, a husband to mourn, and a growing certainty that the system that had killed Robert was now erasing him. She demanded answers. She contacted lawyers, journalists, government officials. She filed requests for information. She spoke to anyone who would listen about her belief that her husband's body had been stolen from her, hidden away, treated not as a human being but as hazardous waste to be disposed of according to the convenience of the powerful. The response was silence, or deflection, or the polite dismissal of a grieving woman who could not accept the reality of her loss. The company denied any wrongdoing. The government agencies cited national security, or privacy, or the need to protect her from information that would only cause her more pain. The few documents that were released were redacted, incomplete, contradictory. The location of the crematorium was never officially confirmed. The records of the cremation, if they existed, were not made available. And so Anna Peabody lived with the mystery. She raised her children, 9 fatherless boys and girls who grew up in the shadow of an accident they were too young to understand, and a disappearance they were too young to question. She worked, she survived, she carried the weight of her suspicions like a second grief. And in 1985, 21 years after Robert's death, she developed throat cancer. The cancer was aggressive. The treatment was brutal. And Anna Peabody became convinced, with the certainty of a woman who had spent 2 decades seeking answers, that her illness was the result of her brief exposure to her dying husband. She had not touched him, had not held him, had not been allowed in the same room. But she had been in the hospital. She had breathed the same air, walked the same corridors, stood in the same spaces where his contaminated body had lain. The radiation that had killed him, she believed, had marked her as well. A delayed sentence passed from husband to wife through the negligence of a system that had never told her the truth. She died in 1985, still believing that Robert's body was hidden somewhere, still demanding answers that never came. Her children, grown now, inherited the mystery. Some accepted the official story, that their father had been cremated, that the ashes were his, that their mother's suspicions were the product of grief and conspiracy thinking. Others were not so sure. The absence of evidence, the irregularities in the record, the silence of the institutions involved, all of these suggested that something had been hidden, that the truth about Robert Peabody's final disposition was known only to a few people who had long since retired or died, taking their secrets with them. The question of the ashes remains unanswered. No documentary evidence has emerged to prove Anna's theory that her husband's body was disposed of in secret. But no evidence has emerged to fully disprove it either. The records of the cremation are incomplete or inaccessible. The facility where it supposedly took place has never been identified. The ashes that Anna received, tested years later by family members with borrowed equipment, showed no signs of the radioactivity that should have been present if they were truly the remains of a man who had received one of the highest radiation doses in history. And so Robert Peabody occupies a strange place in the history of nuclear accidents. He is simultaneously the most documented and the most erased of victims. His death is recorded in government reports, in safety manuals, in the annals of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as a cautionary tale of what can go wrong. But his body, his final physical presence, has disappeared into a gap in the record, a silence where there should be evidence, a mystery that no institution has been willing to solve. The ashes that Anna Peabody kept until her death and that her children inherited may or may not contain the remains of their father. They sit now, somewhere, in a container that cannot be opened without reopening questions that powerful interests have long preferred to leave closed. They are a symbol of the opacity that surrounds nuclear accidents, the tendency of institutions to control information, to manage narratives, to treat human beings as liabilities to be minimized rather than lives to be honored. Robert Peabody deserved better than this. He deserved to be buried with dignity, mourned by his family, remembered as a man who died not through any fault of his own, but because the system in which he placed his trust failed him at every level. Instead, he became a ghost, a statistic, a cautionary tale whose physical existence was apparently too dangerous to be acknowledged. The ashes are all that remain, and the ashes may be a lie. This is the final cruelty of the Wood River Junction accident. Not just the death, not just the suffering, but the erasure. The transformation of a man into a problem, and of that problem into a secret, and of that secret into a silence that has lasted for 60 years. Anna Peabody knew it. Her children know it. And anyone who looks honestly at the record must confront the possibility that we do not know, and may never know, what really happened to the body of the most radioactive man in American history. Robert Peabody died on July 26, 1964. In the months and years that followed, the machinery of accountability began to move, slowly and imperfectly, through the institutions that had failed him. The Atomic Energy Commission conducted an investigation. The state of Rhode Island held hearings. United Nuclear Corporation faced lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny. And yet, when the process was complete, the sum of consequences was shockingly small. The company paid a fine of $8,000 less than the cost of a new car in 1964, a trivial sum for a corporation with government contracts worth millions. No executive was prosecuted. No manager lost their job. The plant at Wood River Junction continued to operate, processing uranium, generating profit, until it finally closed in 1980 for reasons unrelated to the accident that had killed one of its workers. The regulatory changes that followed were modest. The AEC revised its safety guidelines for fuel processing facilities, emphasizing the importance of criticality controls, proper labeling of materials, and training for workers handling fissile substances. These were improvements, but they were improvements that addressed symptoms rather than causes. The underlying culture of the nuclear industry, its emphasis on production over safety, its reliance on undertrained labor, its tolerance of risk in pursuit of government contracts, remained largely intact. The lessons of Wood River Junction were noted, filed, and gradually forgotten, only to be relearned in other accidents, in other countries, with other workers who were just trying to do their jobs. In 1999, 35 years after Peabody's death, another criticality accident occurred at a fuel processing plant in Tokaimura, Japan. Hisashi Uchi, a technician with inadequate training working under pressure to meet production quotas, mistakenly mixed too much uranium solution in a tank. The geometry went critical. The blue flash filled the room. Uchi received a massive radiation dose and died 83 days later after suffering that was extensively documented and widely publicized. The parallels were exact. The same type of facility, the same type of error, the same systemic failures of training and supervision, the same horrifying result. But Uchi's death received attention that Peabody's never did. The Tokaimura accident occurred in the internet age, when images and information could spread globally in hours. Photographs of Uchi in his hospital bed, his body destroyed by radiation, circulated widely, becoming a symbol of the dangers of nuclear power and the failures of industrial safety. Documentaries were made, books were written. Hisashi Uchi became, for many people, the face of radiation accident victims, his suffering a cautionary tale that transcended national boundaries. Robert Peabody remained largely forgotten. His death occurred in a different era, before the digital revolution, before the 24-hour news cycle, before the culture of documentation and exposure that would later make Ouchie infamous. The photographs of Peabody's final hours, if they exist, have never been released. The medical records remain buried in archives. His story was told in local newspapers, in technical reports, in the memories of his family and co-workers. But it never achieved the symbolic power that Ouchies would later command. He died too soon for the age of viral tragedy. He became a footnote instead of a symbol. This is the final injustice. Not just the death, not just the mystery of the ashes, but the erasure from memory. Robert Peabody should be remembered as the first warning, the initial demonstration of what happens when the nuclear industry places profit before safety, when workers are treated as expendable, when the invisible dangers of radiation are managed with carelessness and complacency. His death should be taught in safety courses, cited in regulatory hearings, held up as the beginning of a pattern that continues to this day. Instead, he is unknown to all but specialists and historians. His story overshadowed by later accidents. His name absent from the narratives of nuclear risk that focus on 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, the large-scale disasters that affected thousands, rather than the individual tragedies that affected one family at a time. The facility at Wood River Junction is gone now. The building was demolished, the site decontaminated, the land returned to a state that appears natural but will bear the traces of its history for generations. There is no memorial to Robert Peabody at the location where he died. There is no plaque, no marker, no indication that a man gave his life on this spot because a bottle was mislabeled and a tank was poorly designed. The nuclear industry, which has monuments to its achievements and museums celebrating its history, has no monument to its victims. The dead are buried, the ashes are scattered or hidden, and the industry moves on, promising that this time, finally, the lessons have been learned. Anna Peabody's children are grown now, many of them elderly themselves. Some have spoken publicly about their father, about their mother's suspicions, about the mystery that has defined their family for 60 years. Others have preferred silence, tired of questions that have no answers, weary of a tragedy that has shaped their entire lives without ever being fully explained. They are the true legacy of Robert Peabody. Not the regulatory changes that were minor and temporary, not the safety improvements that were forgotten and repeated, but the 9 children who grew up without a father, who watched their mother die believing she had been lied to, who carry in their DNA and their memories the traces of an accident that should never have happened. The nuclear industry today is different in many ways from the industry of 1964. The regulations are stricter, the oversight more rigorous, the safety culture more developed. The NRC, created a decade after Peabody's death, has powers that the AEC never exercised. The plants that remain operational are, by most measures, safer than they were in the early days of commercial nuclear power. And yet the fundamental tensions remain, between production and safety, between profit and precaution, between the promise of atomic energy and the risks it imposes on the workers who handle its materials. As long as these tensions exist, the ghost of Robert Peabody will walk the corridors of every nuclear facility, a reminder of what happens when the balance tips too far towards speed and away from care. He should be remembered, not as a statistic, not as a cautionary tale, but as a man. A father of 9, a husband, a worker who trusted the system and was betrayed by it, a human being who suffered and died because corners were cut, because warnings were ignored, because the institutions that should have protected him valued his labor more than his life. His death was not an inevitable accident of the atomic age. It was a preventable tragedy, the product of choices made by people who faced no consequences for their negligence. Robert Peabody was the most radioactive man in American history. He was also a man who wanted only to support his family, to do his job, to go home at the end of his shift. The system that employed him could not allow him that simple dignity. It took his life, it took his body, and in the end, it took his memory as well, burying him in footnotes and silence, hiding him from the history he should have shaped. This documentary is an attempt to reverse that erasure, to bring Robert Peabody back into the light, to tell his story not as a technical case study, but as a human tragedy, to honor the man who was killed by the atom, and to demand that his death finally mean something, that the lessons he taught, paid for with his suffering, be learned at last. Because if we forget him, if we allow his story to fade into obscurity, then we are complicit in the same negligence that killed him. We become the system that values production over people, that treats workers as expendable, that hides its mistakes in lead-lined coffins and calls them ashes. Robert Peabody deserves better. His family deserves better. And we, who live in the world that his death helped to shape, owe him the simple act of remembrance. He was here. He lived. He worked. He died. And his ghost walks with us still, waiting for the justice that has been denied him for 60 years.